There comes a moment in every life when a single act of kindness changes everything forever. For 12-year-old Timothy Crawford, that moment arrived on a blazing afternoon in the Old West Desert when he found a giant cowboy kneeling beside his injured horse. The boy had nothing, just worn-out boots and dreams too big for his small frame. Most folks would have walked past the intimidating stranger with his battle-scarred hands and weathered face. But Timothy saw something others missed. He saw a man who cared enough about his horse to sit under the scorching sun, refusing to leave the animal behind. When Timothy offered to help, the giant cowboy looked surprised. Nobody had shown him kindness in years. What started as a simple gesture soon became an adventure neither could imagine. A journey through dangerous outlaw territory where Timothy would learn about courage, loyalty, and what it truly means to be a man. But what treasure was Donovan really searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre when Timothy Crawford slipped out of his family's weathered cabin, his bare feet finding familiar purchase on the packed earth. At 12 years old, he possessed the lean build of a boy who knew hunger more often than plenty, yet his eyes held a brightness that poverty hadn't managed to dim. His father's worn Bible tucked securely under his arm, the only inheritance he'd likely ever receive. Timothy made his way toward the dry creek bed where he often went to think and dream of better days. The Crawford homestead sat on the edge of nowhere, a collection of sun-bleached buildings that seemed to shrink a little more each year under the relentless desert sun. His father, Samuel, worked their meager plot of land with the determination of a man who refused to admit defeat, while his mother, Martha, stretched their scarce resources with the skill of someone who could make a single chicken feed a family of 5 for 3 days. Timothy had 2 younger sisters, Rachel and Hannah, whose laughter still rang through their humble home despite the hardships that pressed down on them like the oppressive heat. But Timothy's heart yearned for something beyond the boundaries of their struggling farm. He devoured every story he could find about brave cowboys, noble lawmen, and adventures in distant territories. The leather-bound Bible his father had given him contained not just scripture, but pressed flowers from his mother and small sketches Timothy had drawn in the margins, pictures of horses galloping across endless plains and men standing tall against impossible odds. On this particular morning, the heat already shimmered off the desert floor like liquid gold, distorting the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Timothy followed the dried creek bed, its banks lined with stubborn sagebrush and the occasional cluster of prickly pear cactus that somehow thrived in this unforgiving landscape. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the soft whisper of wind through the parched grass. It was then that Timothy heard it, a low, rumbling voice carrying across the stillness, speaking words of comfort and concern. Following the sound, he crested a small rise and stopped dead in his tracks. Before him sat a man unlike any he'd ever seen. The stranger was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, even seated on the ground, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His clothes spoke of long miles and hard living, a leather vest worn smooth by weather and time, denim trousers faded nearly white, and boots that had walked through more territory than most men ever saw. A wide-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and dust, shaded a face carved from granite and seasoned by decades under the open sky. But what struck Timothy most wasn't the man's imposing size or weathered appearance. It was the tenderness with which he tended to the magnificent chestnut mare lying on her side before him. The horse was clearly in distress, her coat dark with perspiration, her breathing labored. One of her front legs was clearly injured, bent at an awkward angle that made Timothy's stomach clench with sympathy. "Easy there. Belle," the giant was murmuring, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as they stroked the mare's neck. "I know it hurts, girl. We'll figure something out. We always do." The man's voice carried the weight of years and the roughness of someone accustomed to wide-open spaces rather than polite conversation. Yet there was something in his tone, a deep affection and loyalty that spoke to Timothy's heart. This wasn't just a cowboy and his horse. This was family. Timothy stood frozen for a long moment, clutching his father's Bible against his chest. Everything about the stranger suggested danger. The man wore a gun belt with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Scars crisscrossed his visible skin like a map of violent encounters. His eyes, when they occasionally lifted from the horse, held the alert wariness of a predator, always ready for trouble, but those same eyes also held tears. The giant was crying, not the dramatic sobs of a man who'd lost control, but the quiet tears of someone who'd seen too much loss and couldn't bear to see more. As Timothy watched, the man reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch. He opened it with careful reverence, gazed at whatever was inside, then snapped it closed with a decisive click. "Ain't giving up on you, Belle," the man said firmly, though his voice cracked slightly. "You saved my hide more times than I can count. Time I returned the favor." Timothy found himself taking a step forward, then another. His practical mind warned him to stay away. His mother had always told him to avoid strangers, especially the dangerous kind that drifted through their territory like tumbleweeds. But his heart, the part of him that had always responded to suffering with compassion, wouldn't let him turn away. "Mister," Timothy's voice came out as little more than a whisper. But in the desert silence, it carried clearly. The giant's head snapped up, and Timothy found himself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds. The man's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped when he registered Timothy's youth and obvious harmlessness. "Boy," the stranger said, his voice carefully neutral, "you best move along. This ain't no place for children." Timothy clutched the Bible tighter but didn't retreat. "Your horse, she's hurt bad." "I can see that." The man's tone was gruff but not unkind. "Nothing you can do about it, son. This is between me and Belle. Maybe I can help." The suggestion drew a harsh laugh from the stranger. "Help? Boy, you don't weigh more than a sack of grain soaking wet. What makes you think you could help with something I can't handle myself?" Timothy's cheeks reddened, but he stood his ground. "My pa says sometimes the smallest hands can reach places the big ones can't." For a long moment, the giant studied Timothy's face, taking in the earnest determination and the complete lack of fear, despite the obvious danger the man represented. The silver pocket watch seemed to grow heavier in his palm. "Name's Donovan," he said finally. "Donovan Kane, and this here is Belle." He gestured to the mare, who whickered softly in acknowledgement. "We've been partners for nigh on 8 years now. Pulled me out of more scrapes than I deserved to survive." "I'm Timothy Crawford," the boy replied, taking another step closer. "Timothy Samuel Crawford, and I think your Belle's got something stuck in her hoof. That's why she can't put weight on it." Donovan's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know horses, do you?" "Some. We got 2 on our place. Not as fine as Belle here, but horses all the same." Timothy knelt a respectful distance away, his young eyes taking in the mare's condition with surprising astuteness. "See how she keeps trying to flex that hoof? And the way she's favoring it. Bet there's a stone wedged up in there, something fierce." The giant considered this, then looked down at his own massive hands. "Even if you're right, I can't get a good grip to pull anything out. Fingers too thick, and Belle gets spooked when she's hurting. I could try," Timothy offered quietly. "If you think it might help." Donovan studied the boy for a long moment, weighing options and risks. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Timothy Samuel Crawford. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. Belle's gentle as they come, but a hurt horse can be unpredictable. You understand?" Timothy nodded solemnly, setting his father's Bible carefully on a nearby rock. As he approached the injured mare, Donovan positioned himself at Belle's head, his massive hands ready to steady her if she panicked. "Easy, girl," Timothy murmured, unconsciously echoing Donovan's earlier tone. "Just want to help you feel better." Belle's ears swiveled toward the boy's voice, and something in her dark eyes seemed to calm. Timothy knelt beside her injured hoof, his small hands exploring with the careful confidence of someone who'd learned to be gentle with hurting creatures. "There," he breathed after a moment. "I can feel it, a sharp piece of shale wedged right up between the soul and the frog. It's in there real good." Donovan watched as Timothy worked with surprising skill, his small fingers finding purchase where the man's larger ones would have struggled. The boy's tongue poked out slightly in concentration, and sweat beaded on his forehead from both the effort and the desert heat. "Got it," Timothy announced triumphantly, holding up a jagged piece of dark rock about the size of a silver dollar. No wonder she couldn't walk on it. This thing was like a knife every time she stepped down. Belle seemed to sense the relief immediately. She pulled her leg under her and, with Donovan's help, struggled to her feet. After a moment's hesitation, she put weight on the previously injured hoof and took a few tentative steps. Though she still moved carefully, the agonized limp was gone. Donovan stared at Timothy with undisguised amazement. "I'll be damned," he murmured. "Boy, you just saved my horse. Maybe saved both our lives, truth be told." Timothy flushed with pride, but tried to downplay his contribution. "Weren't nothing special. Just had smaller hands is all." "Don't you diminish what you did," Donovan said firmly, his storm-gray eyes serious. "In my experience, son, there ain't many folks willing to help a stranger, especially one who looks like trouble. You could have walked on by, but you didn't. That says something about the kind of man you're going to become." The words struck Timothy like a physical blow, but in the best possible way. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before, like he was already something more than just a poor farm boy with big dreams. "Where you headed, Mr. Donovan?" Timothy asked as the giant began checking his gear and preparing to remount. Donovan paused, his hand resting on Belle's saddle. For a moment something flickered across his weathered features, doubt, perhaps, or longing. "South," he said finally. "Got some business to attend to." "Old business that's been waiting too long already," Timothy nodded. Though he was burning with curiosity about what kind of business would take a man like Donovan into the dangerous territories beyond the settled lands. He retrieved his father's Bible from the rock and tucked it under his arm again. "Well," Timothy said, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice, "I reckon I should be getting back. Ma will be wondering where I got to." Donovan swung up into his saddle with practiced ease, Belle standing steady beneath his considerable weight. From horseback, he looked even more imposing, a figure out of the adventure stories Timothy loved so much. "Timothy Samuel Crawford," Donovan said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'm in your debt. If you ever find yourself in need of a friend, you remember Donovan Kane. I don't forget kindness, and I don't forget debts." With that, he clicked his tongue, and Belle moved off at an easy walk, both horse and rider disappearing around a bend in the creek bed like something out of a dream. Timothy stood watching long after they'd vanished, his heart pounding with excitement and a strange sense of destiny. He didn't know it yet, but that moment of compassion, that simple decision to help a stranger and his injured horse, would indeed change his life forever. As he walked home, the morning sun climbing higher and the heat beginning to shimmer off the desert floor, Timothy found himself thinking not about his family's struggles or their uncertain future, but about the vast world beyond their small homestead. For the first time in his young life, that world didn't seem quite so impossible to reach. 3 days passed before Timothy saw Donovan Kane again, but the memory of their encounter burned bright in his mind, like a campfire in the darkness. He found himself returning to the dry creek bed each morning, half hoping to glimpse the giant cowboy and his chestnut mare, half convincing himself he was simply enjoying his quiet thinking time before the day's chores began. The Crawford family's routine continued, unchanged, Samuel working their stubborn land while Martha tended the garden and watched over Rachel and Hannah. But Timothy moved through his daily tasks with a distracted air that didn't escape his mother's notice. "You've been wandering in your thoughts, son," Martha observed as they sat on the front porch that evening, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Something troubling you?" Timothy shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to explain the restless energy that had taken hold of him since meeting Donovan. Just thinking about things, Ma. About what's beyond all this. Martha's weathered hands, made rough by years of hard work, reached over to smooth his unruly hair. The Lord has a plan for each of us, Timothy. Sometimes that plan unfolds in ways we don't expect. Her words proved prophetic, sooner than either of them imagined. The fourth morning dawned with an unusual stillness, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Timothy made his way to the creek bed earlier than usual, drawn by an urgency he couldn't name. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when he spotted movement in the distance, a lone rider approaching at an easy lope. It was Donovan, and even from a distance, Timothy could see something was different. The giant's posture spoke of tension, his head constantly turning as he scanned the landscape around him. Belle moved with the alertness of a horse, sensing her rider's unease. When Donovan spotted Timothy, he changed direction and rode straight toward him. As he drew closer, Timothy could see the worry etched deep in the man's weathered features. "Timothy," Donovan said without preamble as he dismounted. "Good to see you again, son. I was hoping I might run into you. Is everything all right, Mr. Donovan?" Timothy asked, noting the way the man's eyes continued to sweep their surroundings even as they talked. Donovan was quiet for a long moment, one hand absently stroking Belle's neck while the other rested on the grip of his gun. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Boy, I'm going to show you something, and I need you to understand the importance of keeping it to yourself. Can you do that?" Timothy nodded solemnly, his pulse quickening with excitement and apprehension. Donovan reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a piece of weathered leather, unfolding it carefully to reveal a hand-drawn map. The parchment was covered with intricate markings, mountain ranges, creek beds, rock formations, and strange symbols that meant nothing to Timothy but seemed to hold great significance for Donovan. "This here," Donovan said, pointing to various locations on the map, "shows the way to something that's been waiting a long time to be found, something that could change a lot of lives for the better." Timothy studied the crude but detailed drawings, his imagination fired by the possibilities. "Treasure?" he whispered. "Of a sort," Donovan replied carefully. "Gold that was hidden during the war. Confederate gold that was meant to help families who lost everything. Good folks who needed a fresh start but never got the chance." The boy's eyes widened. He'd heard stories of lost Civil War treasure, tales that seemed more legend than fact. But here was tangible proof, held in the scarred hands of a man who clearly knew its value. "Why are you showing me this?" Timothy asked. Donovan folded the map carefully and tucked it back into his saddlebags. "Because I might need your help, son. And because there are others who know about this gold. Folks who don't have the same intentions I do." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached their ears. Donovan's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid with alertness. Belle's ears pricked forward, and she took an involuntary step closer to her master. "Get down," Donovan commanded quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Timothy dropped to his knees behind a cluster of sagebrush, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the sparse vegetation, he watched as 3 riders crested the ridge above them, silhouetted against the morning sky like harbingers of trouble. The men were hard-looking characters, the kind Timothy had heard his father warn against. They wore their guns with casual familiarity, and their eyes held the cold calculation of predators scanning for prey. Even from a distance, Timothy could sense the menace they carried like a physical presence. "Cain," one of them called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "We know you're down there. No point in hiding like a scared rabbit." Donovan straightened slowly, his hands moving to rest casually on his gun belt. "Murdoch," he replied, his tone neutral but alert. "You boys are a long way from anywhere. Must be something mighty important brought you out here." The leader of the 3 men, a lean figure with a hawk-like face and eyes like chips of flint, urged his horse forward. "You know damn well why we're here, Cain. That map you've been carrying around belongs to rightful owners." "Rightful owners." Donovan's voice carried a note of dark amusement. Last I checked, Murdoch, you and your boys never fought for anything more noble than your next drink and your next dollar. That gold was hidden by better men than any of us. Timothy watched in fascination as the two men faced each other across the 20 yards that separated them. The tension was so thick he could almost taste it, like the electric charge in the air before a thunderstorm. Maybe so, Murdoch replied with a cold smile. But those better men are dead and buried, and that gold ain't doing nobody any good sitting in the ground. We figure it's time to put it to better use. Your kind of use, you mean? Our kind of use, Murdoch confirmed. Now you can hand over that map peaceful-like, or we can take it off your corpse. Makes no difference to us. Donovan's laugh was like the rumble of distant thunder. 3 against 1, Murdoch? Those aren't sporting odds, even for scum like you. Should have thought of that before you decided to go treasure hunting on your own. What happened next unfolded with the terrible speed of violence unleashed. Murdoch's hand dropped toward his gun, and suddenly the morning air exploded with the crack of gunfire. Timothy pressed his face to the ground, his ears ringing from the deafening noise. When the shooting stopped, Timothy cautiously raised his head. Donovan stood exactly where he'd been, smoke rising from the barrel of his Colt. Of the 3 riders, only Murdoch remained in his saddle, and he was clutching his right shoulder while his horse danced nervously beneath him. His 2 companions lay motionless on the ground. Should have listened to your own advice, Murdoch, Donovan said calmly, never taking his eyes off the wounded man. Next time you might want to bring better men. These 2 were slow. Murdoch's face was twisted with pain and rage. This ain't over, Kane. There's more of us than just these 3. A lot more. And we know you're heading south with that map. Then I reckon you know what you're up against, Donovan replied. Question is, are you stupid enough to keep coming? Instead of answering, Murdoch wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as he'd appeared. The 2 fallen men would not be following. Timothy rose on shaking legs, his mouth dry as desert sand. He'd never witnessed violence like this. The casual, deadly efficiency with which Donovan had defended himself was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. You all right, son? Donovan asked, his voice gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. Timothy nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. Everything felt different now. The morning air, the landscape, even his own skin seemed to fit differently than it had just minutes ago. Mr. Donovan, he said quietly, what happens now? The giant cowboy looked down at him for a long moment, and Timothy saw something in those storm-gray eyes that hadn't been there before, a mixture of regret and determination that spoke of difficult decisions ahead. Now, boy, I've got to move fast. Murdoch wasn't lying about having more men, and they'll be coming hard once word gets back to them. Donovan paused, studying Timothy's face. Question is, what do you want to do? What do you mean? I mean, son, that you've seen what kind of men are after this treasure, and you've seen what I'm willing to do to stop them. If you want to walk away right now, go back to your family and forget any of this happened. I wouldn't blame you one bit. Timothy looked at the map tucked safely in Donovan's saddlebags, then at the 2 still forms on the ground, then finally at the man who had trusted him with a secret that could cost both their lives. What would happen to all those families? The ones the gold was meant to help? He asked. Without the map, they'll never see a penny of it. Murdoch and his kind will tear this territory apart, looking for it. But they'll never find it without the landmarks I've memorized. Timothy thought of his own family's struggles, of his mother stretching their meager resources, and his father working land that seemed determined to defeat him. He thought of all the other families out there facing the same hardships. Families who might have a chance at something better if the treasure reached its intended destination. I want to come with you, he said, the words coming out stronger and more certain than he'd expected. Donovan shook his head immediately. Timothy, you don't understand what you're saying. This isn't some adventure story from one of your books. Those men will kill us both without blinking if they catch us, and there'll be more of them before this is over. I understand, Timothy replied, surprised by his own conviction. But you said yourself you might need my help, and maybe this is what I'm supposed to do. Maybe this is why I found you that day by the creek. The giant cowboy studied him for a long moment, weighing the boy's determination against the dangers that lay ahead. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, Timothy Samuel Crawford. But if we do this, we do it right. No half measures, no turning back once we start. You follow my lead. You do exactly what I tell you when I tell you to do it. And you understand that there's a good chance neither one of us is coming back from this. Timothy's hand moved instinctively to touch his father's Bible, still tucked securely against his side. I understand, Mr. Donovan, and I'm ready. As Donovan helped him up onto Belle's back behind the saddle, Timothy caught one last glimpse of his family's distant homestead. By the time he saw it again, if he ever saw it again, he would be a very different person than the boy who was riding away from it now. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Belle carried her two riders deeper into the untamed wilderness south of the Crawford homestead. Timothy had never been this far from home, and with each mile that passed beneath the mare's steady hooves, he felt the familiar world of his childhood slipping further behind him, like water through his fingers. Donovan rode with the alertness of a man who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. His army-issue compass, a battered brass instrument that had guided him through more battles than Timothy could imagine, never far from his hand. Every few minutes, he would check their heading, consulting the mental map he carried of the territory ahead, while scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. First rule of staying alive out here. "Son," Donovan said as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of broken rock, "is never let your guard down. The desert doesn't care about your good intentions, and the men following us care even less." Timothy nodded, trying to absorb everything the giant was teaching him. The boy had thought he knew something about hardship from his family's struggles on their poor farm, but this was different. This was survival in its rawest form. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could be fatal. As the afternoon wore on, Donovan began sharing fragments of knowledge that would keep them alive in this hostile landscape. He showed Timothy how to read the subtle signs that indicated water might be found nearby, the flight patterns of birds, the way certain plants grew in barely perceptible lines across the desert floor, the color of rocks that had been touched by underground springs. "During the war," Donovan said as they paused to let Belle drink from a small, hidden pool they discovered beneath an outcropping of red stone, "I learned that knowing the land could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Same principle applies here. The desert will tell you its secrets if you know how to listen." Timothy found himself fascinated by these glimpses into Donovan's past. The compass the man carried bore the initials USA and showed signs of heavy use. When Timothy asked about it, Donovan's weathered face grew distant. "Carried this through 2 years of fighting," he said simply. "It never steered me wrong, even when everything else went to hell around us. A good compass and a clear sense of direction. Sometimes that's all that stands between a man and disaster." As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered canyon where the walls would hide their fire and provide protection from the wind. Donovan moved with practiced efficiency, gathering dried wood and selecting the best spot for their bedrolls. Timothy tried to help, but he felt clumsy and inexperienced compared to the giant's sure movements. "You're doing fine, son," Donovan said, noticing the boy's frustration. "Nobody's born knowing how to survive in country like this. It's all learned, and you're learning fast." That first night around the campfire was unlike anything Timothy had ever experienced. The flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, while above them, more stars than the boy had ever imagined filled the vast darkness of the desert sky. The silence was profound, not the comfortable quiet of home, but something deeper and more primal that spoke of endless space and ancient mysteries. "Mr. Donovan," Timothy said as they shared a meal of hardtack and jerky, "how do you know for certain that the gold is still where the map shows?" Donovan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "Because I was there when it was buried," he said finally. "I was one of the men who helped hide it." Timothy's eyes widened. "You were a Confederate soldier." "Was," Donovan confirmed, "until I couldn't be any more. until I realized that some things matter more than flags and causes. He pulled out his compass again, turning it over in his scarred hands. This compass guided me through battles that shouldn't have been fought, helped me carry out orders that kept me awake at night. But it also led me to understand something important. What's that? That a man's true direction isn't always the same as the one he's been given. Sometimes you have to choose your own path, even when it goes against everything you've been taught. Timothy sensed there was more to the story. Much more, but he didn't push. Instead, he asked, what happened to the other men who knew about the treasure? Donovan's face grew even more somber. Dead, all of them. Killed in the fighting, or died of sickness afterward, or just worn down by trying to rebuild their lives when everything they'd known was gone. He looked directly at Timothy. I'm the only one left who knows exactly where that gold is buried, son, which makes me both very valuable and very dangerous to men like Murdoch. The weight of that responsibility settled on Timothy like a heavy blanket. They weren't just carrying a map. They were carrying the hopes and dreams of countless families who had lost everything in the war. The magnitude of what they were attempting began to dawn on him. Are you scared? Timothy asked quietly. Every man with sense is scared when the stakes are high, Donovan replied. The trick is not letting fear make your decisions for you. Fear can keep you alive if you listen to it right, but it can also paralyze you when action is what's needed. As the fire burned lower, they heard the distant howl of a coyote, answered by another, then another, until the canyon echoed with their wild voices. Timothy shivered, pulling his thin blanket closer around his shoulders. They're not interested in us, Donovan said calmly. Just talking to each other across the distances. Desert folk have their own ways of communicating, but even as he spoke, Timothy noticed that Donovan never fully relaxed. The man's hand remained near his gun, even as he settled down to sleep, and his eyes continued to scan their surroundings until the last ember of their fire died away. Timothy lay awake for a long time that first night, staring up at the stars and listening to the alien sounds of the desert. Everything was different here. The air smelled different, felt different on his skin. The vastness was both exhilarating and terrifying. For a boy who had never been more than 5 miles from his family's homestead, this felt like being transported to another world entirely. When he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with images of hidden gold and dangerous men, of endless landscapes and campfires under impossible skies. But through it all ran a thread of excitement, of purpose, that he had never felt before. For the first time in his young life, Timothy Crawford was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. He woke before dawn to find Donovan already stirring, the giant's internal clock attuned to the rhythms of survival. Without speaking, they broke camp and resumed their journey south, following the path laid out in the map and guided by the steady needle of Donovan's compass. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, they had already traveled. Timothy knew that dangerous men were following, but ahead lay adventure, purpose, and the chance to make a real difference in the world. As Belle carried them toward their uncertain destiny, Timothy found himself thinking not of home and safety, but of the families who were counting on them, families they had never met, but whose futures now rested in their hands. The third day of their journey brought them to a landscape that seemed carved from a fever dream. Towering red rock formations thrust up from the desert floor like the bones of ancient giants, their surfaces sculpted by wind and time into fantastic shapes that defied imagination. Timothy had never seen country like this. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder of just how small and vulnerable they were in the face of such vast, indifferent forces. They had been riding for most of the morning when they encountered the travelers. 3 men on horseback appeared on the trail ahead, coming from the opposite direction. Even at a distance, Timothy could see that Donovan tensed in the saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. But these weren't the hard-faced killers who had attacked them back at the creek. These men had the look of ordinary cowboys, dusty, tired, and more interested in getting somewhere than causing trouble. "Morning," called the lead rider as the 2 groups drew closer. He was a middle-aged man with graying whiskers and the deep tan of someone who spent his life under the open sky. "Fine day for traveling." "Morning," Donovan replied, his voice carefully neutral. The three men pulled up their horses, clearly interested in conversation. It was a natural thing in this empty country, travelers sharing news and information when their paths crossed. "Name's Patterson," the lead man said. "These are my partners, Johnson and Mitchell. We're heading north to the railroad. You boys wouldn't happen to know the state of the trails up that way, would you?" Timothy waited for Donovan to answer, but the giant seemed to be studying the three men with unusual intensity. There was something in his posture that suggested coiled danger, like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Trails are clear enough," Donovan said finally, "though you might want to keep your eyes open. There's been some unsavory characters moving through the area lately." Patterson nodded knowingly. "Always is, out here in the territories. A man's got to watch his back." He paused, his eyes moving from Donovan to Timothy and back again. "You wouldn't happen to be Donovan Kane, would you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Timothy felt his heart begin to pound, and he could sense the change that came over Donovan, a subtle shift in the way he held his body that spoke of imminent violence. "Depends who's asking," Donovan replied. His voice deadly quiet. Patterson's hand moved toward his gun, and suddenly Timothy understood. These weren't random travelers at all. They were hunters, and Donovan was their prey. What happened next unfolded with the same terrible swiftness that Timothy had witnessed back at the creek. But this time, he was close enough to see every detail. Donovan's Colt appeared in his hand, as if by magic, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the red rock walls like thunder. When the smoke cleared, Patterson lay motionless in the dirt, while his two companions spurred their horses into desperate flight. Neither one brave enough to continue the fight without their leader. Timothy stared at the fallen man, his stomach churning. This was the second time he'd watched Donovan kill someone, and it wasn't getting any easier to witness. "Mr. Donovan," he said quietly, "how did you know?" Donovan holstered his gun and dismounted to examine the dead man's belongings. "Patterson made a mistake," he said grimly. "He knew my name without me giving it to him. That meant he'd been told to look for me specifically. From Patterson's saddlebags." Donovan retrieved a bullet-riddled cavalry saddle, clearly military issue, but old and bearing the scars of numerous battles. The leather was stained dark in several places, and Timothy realized with a sick feeling that some of those stains were probably blood. "This belonged to a good man once," Donovan said, running his fingers over the damaged leather. "A man who died fighting for what he believed was right. Seeing it on scum like Patterson is like spitting on his grave." Timothy looked at the saddle with new eyes, understanding that it represented something important to Donovan, a connection to his past, perhaps, or a reminder of comrades who hadn't lived to see the end of the war. "How many more will there be?" Timothy asked. "As many as it takes," Donovan replied grimly. "Word's gotten out that I'm carrying the map, and there's a lot of gold at stake. Every gun for hire between here and Mexico is going to be looking for us." They resumed their journey, but the mood had changed. Timothy found himself constantly scanning the horizon, jumping at shadows, and starting at every sound. The vast landscape that had seemed so beautiful just hours earlier now felt hostile and threatening, full of hidden dangers and potential enemies. As they rode, Donovan began sharing more of his knowledge about survival in hostile territory. He taught Timothy how to read tracks in the sand, how to spot the signs of an ambush, how to use natural cover to avoid being seen by enemies. But more than that, he began to reveal glimpses of the man he had been during the war. "Fighting's not about being brave," he said as they paused to rest Bell in the shade of a massive boulder. "It's about staying alive long enough to complete your mission. Brave men die just as dead as cowards if they don't use their heads." Timothy studied the scarred cavalry saddle that now rode with their gear, and he began to understand something about the burden Donovan carried. This wasn't just about treasure, it was about honor, about finishing something that had been left undone, about keeping faith with men who were no longer alive to keep faith with themselves. Were you scared during the war? Timothy asked. Terrified, Donovan admitted without hesitation. Every battle, every charge, every night when we didn't know if we'd see morning. But fear keeps you sharp, son. It keeps you alive when being careless would get you killed. Did you ever want to quit? To just walk away? Donovan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point that Timothy couldn't see. Every day, he said finally. But walking away isn't always an option. Sometimes a man has obligations that go deeper than his own comfort or safety. As evening approached, they made camp in another hidden canyon, but this time Donovan was even more careful about concealing their presence. He insisted on a cold camp, no fire that might give away their position, and he positioned their bedrolls where they would be hidden from any observer. Above, from here on, he said as they shared, another cheerless meal of cold provisions. We assume we're being hunted every moment of every day. No unnecessary risks, no careless mistakes. The men coming after us won't give us a second chance if we slip up. Timothy nodded, understanding that the easy camaraderie of their first few days was over. They were no longer just travelers on an adventure. They were fugitives carrying something that desperate men would kill for. That night, as he lay wrapped in his blanket under the star-filled sky, Timothy found himself thinking about the families back home, his own family, and all the others who were struggling to rebuild their lives after the devastation of war. The gold they were seeking wasn't just treasure, it was hope. The chance for a better future for people who had lost everything. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming for a 12-year-old boy, but Timothy found strength in the knowledge that he wasn't carrying it alone. Beside him, Donovan kept watch through the long hours of darkness, a guardian whose vigilance never wavered. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new tests of their courage and determination. But tonight, Timothy felt something he had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction that came from being part of something truly important, something that would matter long after he was gone. By the 5th day of their journey, the landscape had changed again, giving way to rolling hills, dotted with scrub oak, and crossed by meandering streams that actually held water year-round. It was in this more hospitable country that they encountered the border town of Esperanza, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, populated by the kind of people who chose to live on the edge of civilization. Timothy had never seen a place like Esperanza. The main street was little more than a wide dirt path, lined with saloons, trading posts, and establishments whose purposes he could only guess at. Men wore their guns openly and watched strangers with calculating eyes. Women dressed in bright colors and bold fabrics that his mother would have considered scandalous. The air smelled of dust, tobacco, and something indefinable that spoke of secrets and danger. "Stay close, son," Donovan murmured as they rode slowly down the main thoroughfare, Bell's hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. "And keep your eyes and ears open. In a place like this, information is more valuable than gold, and twice as dangerous." They dismounted in front of a sturdy building bearing a sign that read, "McKenna's Trading Post." The proprietor, a burly man with iron-gray hair and observant eyes, looked up from his ledger as they entered. Well, he said, his voice carrying a trace of Irish accent. "If it isn't the famous Donovan Kane. Heard you might be passing through these parts." Timothy felt Donovan tense beside him, but the giant's voice remained casual. "Word travels fast out here, McKenna." "It does indeed," McKenna agreed, coming around from behind his counter. "Especially when there's money involved. Seems there's quite a bounty on your head these days, enough to make even honest men think dishonest thoughts." From his vest pocket, McKenna withdrew a faded photograph, an image of Donovan in military uniform, standing with a group of other soldiers. Timothy could see that the man in the picture was younger, less weathered by time and hardship, but unmistakably the same person who now stood beside him. "This picture's been making the rounds," McKenna continued. "Seems some folks are very interested in your whereabouts. They're offering serious money for information about where you might be headed." Donovan studied the photograph with an expression Timothy couldn't read. Where did you get this, Sean? Fellow came through here 2 days ago. Big man, well-dressed, spoke like he had education and money behind him. Said he represented certain parties who had an interest in settling old debts with you. McKenna's eyes moved to Timothy. Didn't mention anything about you traveling with a boy, though. That's interesting. Timothy looked more closely at the photograph, fascinated by this glimpse into Donovan's past. The men in the picture all had the look of soldiers, young, serious, bonded by shared danger and common purpose. But what struck him most was the way they stood together, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling with the easy camaraderie of brothers. "Those your fallen comrades?" McKenna asked gently, noticing Timothy's interest. Donovan nodded slowly. "Every one of them. Good men who died believing they were fighting for something important." He looked up at McKenna. "What else did this well-dressed fellow tell you?" "Said there were others coming. Rough men with no particular scruples about how they earn their money. Said if I were to encounter you, it would be in my best interest to get word to him immediately." McKenna smiled grimly. "Of course, he didn't know about our history, did he?" "No," Donovan agreed. "He didn't." Timothy sensed undercurrents in the conversation that he didn't fully understand, but it was clear that McKenna and Donovan shared some connection from the past, perhaps from the war years, perhaps from something more recent. "Sean," Donovan said quietly, "I need supplies. Food for a week, ammunition, and information about the trails south of here." "Can you help?" McKenna nodded without hesitation. "Of course I can. But Donovan, you need to understand what you're walking into. There are at least a dozen men hunting you now, maybe more. Professional killers with no conscience and no mercy. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you're trying to accomplish, is it worth dying for?" Donovan looked at Timothy, then back at the photograph of his fallen comrades. "It is," he said simply. While McKenna gathered their supplies, Timothy found himself drawn to the trading post's collection of books and newspapers. Most were months old, but they offered glimpses of a wider world beyond the harsh realities of desert survival. In one newspaper, he found an article about families still struggling to rebuild after the war. Widows trying to raise children alone, former soldiers unable to find work, entire communities trying to recover from devastation that had swept across the land like a plague. "Heavy reading for a young man," McKenna observed, noticing Timothy's absorption in the article. "My pa says it's important to understand what's happening in the world," Timothy replied. "Even if we can't do much about it from where we live." "Wise man, your father," McKenna said. "And you're wise to listen to him. Too many people prefer to remain ignorant of others' suffering. Makes their own lives seem easier." When their business was concluded and they were preparing to leave, McKenna pulled Donovan aside for a private conversation. Timothy couldn't hear the words, but he could see the serious expressions on both men's faces. The way McKenna gripped Donovan's shoulder in a gesture of brotherhood and concern. "Take care of that boy," Timothy heard McKenna say as they parted. "He's got good eyes and a good heart. Don't let this business destroy either one." "I won't," Donovan promised. As they rode out of Esperanza, Timothy found himself looking back at the ramshackle town with mixed feelings. It had been exciting to see a wider slice of frontier life, but also sobering to realize how many people knew about their mission and how many of those people might be willing to betray them for money. "Mr. Donovan," he said as they gained distance from the settlement, "what did Mr. McKenna mean about your history together?" Donovan was quiet for a moment, the photograph still tucked in his vest pocket. "Sean and I served together during the war. He was one of the few men I trusted completely, still is for that matter. When he says there are professional killers on our trail, I believe him. Aren't you scared?" "Terrified," Donovan admitted, "but not for myself. I've lived my life, made my choices, and I can accept the consequences. But you're just a boy, Timothy. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I feel responsible for putting you in danger." Timothy considered this as they rode through the gathering dusk. "Mr. Donovan, remember what you told me about obligation, about sometimes having responsibilities that go deeper than comfort or safety?" "I remember. Well, I think maybe I understand that now. This isn't just about treasure, is it? It's about keeping faith with those soldiers in the photograph. It's about making sure their sacrifice meant something. Donovan looked at him with something approaching amazement. You're growing up fast, son. Maybe too fast. Maybe, Timothy agreed. But maybe that's what's needed right now. As they made camp that night, in a grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream, Timothy found himself thinking about the photograph McKenna had shown them. All those young men, standing together with such confidence and hope, believing in their cause and in each other. Now they were all gone except for Donovan, and their dreams, their hopes for the future, rested on his shoulders alone. It was a heavy burden for any man to carry, Timothy realized. But it was a burden worth bearing, because some things were more important than individual safety or comfort. Some things were worth risking everything for. The seventh day of their journey brought them into country that seemed touched by something beyond the ordinary world. Ancient land where the very rocks seemed to hold memories of peoples and times long forgotten. Here, red sandstone formations rose like cathedrals against the endless sky, and the wind carried voices that might have been whispers from the past or simply the eternal conversation between earth and air. It was in this sacred landscape that they encountered the Apache. Timothy saw them first, 3 riders on painted ponies, silhouetted against the morning sky like figures from another age. They sat their horses with perfect stillness, watching the approaching travelers with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. Easy. Son, Donovan murmured, his voice carrying a respect that Timothy had never heard before. These are Chiricahua Apache. We're in their territory now, and we go only where they allow us to go. The lead rider, an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent reading the language of desert and sky, guided his pony down the slope toward them. He wore traditional buckskin, adorned with intricate beadwork, and around his neck hung an ancient Native American arrowhead carved from obsidian, black as night and sharp enough to cut the wind itself. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "You are the one they call Cain," he said simply, "the one who carries the burden of his fallen brothers." Timothy felt a chill run down his spine. How could this stranger know so much about their mission? "I am," Donovan replied, inclining his head in a gesture of respect. "And you are the one they call Wise Crow, keeper of the old ways." The Apache elder smiled slightly. "The desert speaks to those who know how to listen, Cain. It tells of 2 travelers, a man seeking to honor the dead and a boy whose heart burns with the fire of justice. It tells of others following, men whose spirits are dark with greed and violence." Timothy looked around at the seemingly empty landscape, wondering what signs Wise Crow could read in the stone and sand that told him so much. "We seek passage through your lands," Donovan said formally. "We mean no harm to your people. We know this," Wise Crow replied. "The question is not your intentions, but your worthiness. The place you seek is sacred to my people, a place where the spirits of the earth guard secrets that should be disturbed only for the most noble purposes." From his position on the slope, one of the other Apache warriors made a gesture that Timothy didn't understand, but Wise Crow nodded in response. "My grandson says the boy has the look of one whose spirit walks in balance," the elder continued, his dark eyes studying Timothy with uncomfortable intensity. "He says your young companion carries no darkness in his heart." Timothy felt heat rise in his cheeks, unsure how to respond to such scrutiny. But there was something in the old man's presence that demanded honesty rather than false modesty. "I'm trying to do what's right," Timothy said quietly. "That's all." Wise Crow dismounted from his pony with fluid grace, despite his obvious age. Approaching Timothy, he reached out and touched the ancient arrowhead that hung around his neck. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," he said solemnly. "It has been blessed by 4 generations of medicine men, and it carries the power to see into the hearts of men." He removed the thong from around his neck and, to Timothy's amazement, placed it around the boys. "You will carry this now, young one. It will help you find your way when the path becomes unclear." Timothy felt the weight of the arrowhead against his chest, not just its physical weight, but the spiritual significance of the gift he had just received. The obsidian was warm to the touch, as if it held some internal fire. "But why?" Timothy asked. "Because the spirits have whispered that you will need its guidance before your journey ends," Wise Crow replied. "Because you are walking a path that will test not just your courage, but your soul." Turning to Donovan, the elder's expression grew more serious. "The men who follow you are close now, less than a day behind. They have made camp at the old trading post ruins, and they speak of taking you alive so they can force you to reveal what they seek." Donovan's jaw tightened. "How many?" 12, perhaps 15. Well-armed and experienced in violence. But they do not know this country as we do, and they do not understand the power of the sacred places." Wise Crow gestured toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the red rock formations. "There is a path through the stone maze that will take you where you need to go. It is treacherous and difficult, and few white men have ever walked it and lived. But it will hide your passage from those who hunt you, and the price." Donovan asked, understanding that such aid would not come free. "No price," Wise Crow said simply. "Only a promise. Promise that when you find what you seek, you will remember that some things are more precious than gold. Promise that you will honor the spirits of this place and the memory of all those who have died for justice." "I promise," Donovan said without hesitation. The Apache elder nodded solemnly, then turned his attention back to Timothy. "The path ahead will change you, young one. You began this journey as a boy seeking adventure, but you will end it as a man who understands the weight of responsibility. Are you prepared for this transformation?" Timothy touched the arrowhead at his throat, feeling its warmth against his skin. "I think so," he said honestly. "I hope so. Hope is good," Wise Crow agreed. "But hope must be paired with wisdom and courage, or it becomes merely wishful thinking." The elder remounted his pony and prepared to depart, but before leaving, he offered one final piece of guidance. "When you reach the place where the earth reveals its secrets," he said, "remember that true treasure is not what can be held in the hands, but what can be carried in the heart. The gold you seek will help many people, but the lessons you learn on this journey will echo through generations." As the 3 Apache riders disappeared back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, Timothy found himself filled with a sense of awe and responsibility that he had never experienced before. The arrowhead seemed to pulse against his chest like a second heartbeat, connecting him to something larger and more ancient than his own small existence. "Mr. Donovan," he said as they prepared to enter the canyon path Wise Crow had indicated, "do you think he was right? About me changing, I mean." Donovan looked at him with an expression that mixed pride and sadness. "I think you've already changed more than you realize, son. The boy who helped me with Belle that first day is still there, but he's growing into something more, something better." As they guided Belle into the narrow canyon, the walls rising high above them, like the ramparts of some impossible fortress, Timothy felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Behind them, dangerous men were closing in with violence and greed in their hearts. Ahead lay unknown perils and the culmination of their quest, but around his neck hung the blessing of ancient wisdom. And beside him rode a man whose courage and honor had been tested in the fires of war and found true. Whatever came next, Timothy knew he was no longer the same frightened farm boy who had once dreamed of adventure from the safety of his family's porch. The canyon path led them deeper into the heart of the ancient stone maze, where shadows danced with light and the very air seemed charged with spiritual energy. Timothy had never felt so small, and yet so connected to something vast and eternal. The Apache arrowhead at his throat seemed to grow warmer with each step Belle took along the narrow trail. It was during their second day in the canyon that everything Timothy thought he knew about Donovan Kane and their mission was turned upside down. They had stopped to rest in a circular chamber where the walls opened up to reveal ancient petroglyphs, symbols and figures carved into the rock by hands long turned to dust. Timothy was studying the mysterious drawings when he noticed Donovan, sitting apart, staring at something he had withdrawn from his vest pocket. It wasn't the tarnished silver pocket watch or the faded photograph Timothy had seen before. This was different, a military decoration of some kind, its blue ribbon faded, but its gold star still gleaming despite years of careful handling. "Mr. Donovan?" Timothy said cautiously. "What is that?" For a long moment Donovan didn't respond. Then, with obvious reluctance, he held out the medal so Timothy could see it clearly. Even at 12 years old, the boy recognized the distinctive shape and significance of what he was looking at. "That's a Medal of Honor," Timothy whispered, his eyes widening with amazement. "It is," Donovan confirmed quietly, but that means you're a hero, a real hero. They only give those to the bravest soldiers, the ones who saved other people's lives at terrible risk to themselves." Donovan's laugh was bitter. "Hero. That's what they called me when they pinned this on my chest, said I was a credit to my uniform and my country, said my actions at Antietam Creek saved the lives of 43 men who would have died without my intervention." Timothy waited, sensing that there was much more to the story. "What they didn't say," Donovan continued, his voice heavy with old pain, "was what happened afterward. They didn't mention that I disobeyed direct orders to save those men. They didn't explain that I abandoned my position and risked court-martial to do what I thought was right." The giant cowboy stood and walked to the canyon wall, his fingers tracing the ancient symbols carved there by people who had understood something about honor that his own commanders had forgotten. "Timothy," Donovan said without turning around, "what I'm about to tell you changes everything. The treasure we're seeking, it's not what you think it is." Timothy felt his heart begin to race. "What do you mean?" "The Confederate gold is real enough, buried exactly where the map shows, hidden by men who thought they were preserving something for the future of the South. But that's not why I'm seeking it." Donovan turned to face the boy, and Timothy saw tears glistening in the giant's storm-gray eyes. "Those families I told you about, the ones who lost everything in the war and never got help rebuilding their lives, they weren't Southern families, son. They were Union families, widows of men who died fighting against the Confederacy, children whose fathers never came home from battles like Gettysburg and Bull Run." Timothy stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand. After the war ended, I saw what was happening to the families of fallen Union soldiers. The government promised them pensions and aid, but bureaucracy and corruption meant most of them never saw a penny. I watched good people, honorable people who had already sacrificed more than anyone should have to, slowly starve while politicians made speeches about healing the nation." Donovan sat down heavily on a fallen rock, the Medal of Honor still gleaming in his palm. "That's when I decided that the Confederate gold, money that was meant to perpetuate a war I'd come to see as wrong, could serve a better purpose. I deserted. My post stole the map from military archives and set out to find that treasure so I could distribute it to the families who really needed it." Timothy felt the world spinning around him. But that makes you a traitor," Donovan finished quietly, "a deserter, an outlaw who stole military secrets and abandoned his duty to his country." "No," Timothy said fiercely, surprising himself with the strength of his conviction. "That makes you even more of a hero than the medal does." Donovan looked up at him with amazement. "How can you say that, son? I broke my oath. I violated everything I swore to defend." "You broke rules to help people who needed help," Timothy replied, his hand moving instinctively to touch the Apache arrowhead at his throat. "You risked everything to do what was right, even when it meant giving up everything you had." "That's one way to look at it," Donovan said. "But the law sees it differently. So do the men who are hunting us. They're not just after treasure, Timothy. They're after a war criminal who's been evading justice for over a decade." Timothy absorbed this revelation, understanding now why so many dangerous men were pursuing them with such determination. It wasn't just greed driving them. It was the substantial bounty that would be placed on the head of a decorated soldier who had betrayed his uniform. "How many families have you helped?" Timothy asked. 47 so far over the past 8 years. Widows who were able to keep their farms, children who got the education their fathers died for, men who lost limbs in the service and couldn't work anymore. I made sure they could live with dignity. And the gold we're seeking now will help maybe 100 more families, maybe more if I'm careful about how it's distributed. Donovan looked directly at Timothy. But son, you need to understand what this means. If we're caught, I'll hang for desertion and theft. And you'll be branded as an accomplice to a wanted fugitive. Timothy was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had learned. The mission hadn't changed. They were still seeking treasure to help families in need, but the stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the man he had come to admire was considered a criminal by the very government that had once honored him. "Mr. Donovan," he said finally, "my pa always told me that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when everyone's watching and the rules are clear. It's measured by what he does when he's alone with his conscience and has to choose between what's easy and what's right." Donovan smiled for the first time since beginning his confession. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is. And he taught me that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is stand up against the system when the system is wrong." Timothy stood up, his young face set with determination. "Those families you've helped, they're alive and thriving because you chose to break unjust laws. That medal you're carrying isn't just for what you did at Antietam Creek. It's for what you've been doing ever since. Even if it means we're both outlaws." "Even if it means that," Timothy confirmed, "because some things are more important than staying out of trouble." Donovan studied the boy's face, seeing in it a maturity and moral clarity that humbled him. "You know there's no turning back from this, don't you? Once we reach that treasure site, once we take that gold, there'll be no going home to your family's farm, no returning to the simple life you've always known." Timothy touched the arrowhead again, drawing strength from its ancient wisdom. "Wise Crow said this journey would change me from a boy into a man. Maybe this is part of that change. Learning that growing up sometimes means accepting consequences you never expected." "I won't let anything happen to you," Donovan promised. "Whatever it costs me, I'll make sure you get home safely. And I won't let you face this alone," Timothy replied. "We're partners, remember? We see this through together, whatever comes." As they prepared to resume their journey through the canyon maze, Timothy found himself thinking about heroism and what it really meant. The stories he had always loved were full of knights and cowboys who fought clear battles against obvious villains. But real heroism, he was beginning to understand, was messier and more complicated. It required choosing between competing loyalties, risking everything for people you had never met, and accepting the consequences of doing what was right even when the world called it wrong. Donovan Kane wasn't the simple adventure hero Timothy had imagined when they first met. He was something far more complex and in many ways far more admirable, a man who had sacrificed his reputation, his security, and his future to help people who had no other champion. As Belle carried them deeper into the sacred canyon, Timothy realized that he was no longer following Donovan just for adventure or even for treasure. He was following him because sometimes, when the world has forgotten justice, it falls to ordinary people to remember it, even if that memory makes them outlaws. The ancient canyon walls began to close in around them as they followed the path deeper into the heart of the sacred maze. Each twist and turn of the narrow trail brought them closer to their destination, and closer to the moment when their pursuers would finally catch up with them. Timothy could feel the weight of destiny pressing down, like the massive stone formations that towered above their heads. On the morning of their 9th day together, Donovan called a halt in a small clearing where a natural spring bubbled up from the desert floor. The water was crystal clear and surprisingly cold, a gift from some underground source that had sustained travelers through this harsh landscape for countless generations. "We're close now," Donovan said, consulting his compass and comparing their position to the landmarks he had memorized from the map. maybe 3 hours' ride to the treasure site. But Timothy, I need you to understand something before we go any further." The boy looked up from where he was filling their water containers, noting the serious tone in Donovan's voice. "This is the last chance for you to turn back. Once we reach that burial site, once we dig up that gold, there's no pretending this was just an adventure story. We'll be thieves in the eyes of the law, no matter how noble our intentions." Timothy had been thinking about this moment for days, ever since learning the truth about Donovan's mission and his own status as a Medal of Honor recipient turned outlaw. The weight of the Apache arrowhead around his neck seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, reminding him of Wise Crow's words about transformation and the price of growing up. "Mr. Donovan," Timothy said quietly, "do you remember what you told me about obligation? About having responsibilities that go deeper than personal comfort or safety?" "I remember. Well, I've been thinking about those families, the ones you've already helped, and the ones who are still waiting. 47 families who got a second chance because you were willing to break unjust laws. Maybe 100 more who could have hope again if we succeed." Timothy stood up, his young face set with a determination that would have made his father proud. From the clearing where they had stopped, he gathered several pieces of dried wood and began fashioning them into a rough cross, binding them together with strips of leather from their gear. "What are you doing, son?" Donovan asked. "Making a promise," Timothy replied. "To those families, to your fallen comrades, to everyone who's counting on us to do the right thing even when it's dangerous." He planted the makeshift cross firmly in the sandy soil beside the spring, then knelt before it with his hand on the Apache arrowhead. "I promise," he said solemnly, "to see this through to the end. Not for adventure, not for excitement, but because sometimes doing what's right is more important than doing what's safe." Donovan watched this simple ceremony with growing amazement. The boy who had started this journey as a dreamy farm child was becoming someone entirely different. Someone with the moral courage to make hard choices and accept their consequences. "You realize what this means?" Donovan asked. "Not just for the next few days, but for the rest of your life. Once word gets out about what we've done, you'll never be able to go home again. You'll be a wanted man, same as me." "Maybe," Timothy agreed. "But maybe that's the price of growing up in a world where the system doesn't always serve justice. Maybe being a wanted man is better than being a man who wanted to help, but was too scared to try." The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Both of them froze, listening intently as the sound grew closer. Multiple horses moving fast, and from the direction they had come. "They found our trail," Donovan said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Somehow, they got through the canyon maze faster than I expected." They could hear voices now, carried on the desert wind. Harsh, urgent voices calling orders and coordinates. The bounty hunters were closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. "How many do you think?" Timothy asked, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "Too many," Donovan replied. "More than we can fight head-on." He was already moving, gathering their essential supplies and preparing Bell for rapid travel. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they reach this clearing. We need to get to the treasure site first, and then what?" Donovan looked at him with eyes that held both fierce determination and deep regret. "Then we make our stand, son. We dig up that gold, and we defend it with everything we have." They rode hard for the next hour, pushing Belle to her limits as they raced toward their destination. The landscape around them grew more desolate with each mile. Broken country full of hidden arroyos and towering rock formations that looked like monuments to some forgotten war between earth and sky. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, they crested a ridge and saw it, the place marked on the Confederate map. A natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, where ancient petroglyphs covered the walls and a single, massive boulder stood like a sentinel in the center. "There," Donovan said, pointing to the base of the great stone. "That's where they buried it. 15 years of waiting, and we're finally here." They dismounted and approached the boulder on foot. Up close, Timothy could see that it wasn't entirely natural. One side had been carefully carved with symbols that matched those on the map, creating a permanent marker that would endure long after paper had crumbled to dust. Donovan began digging at the base of the stone, his powerful hands making quick work of the sandy soil. Timothy helped as best he could, though his smaller size limited his effectiveness with the heavy work. "There," Donovan breathed after 20 minutes of hard labor. His shovel had struck something solid, wood by the sound of it. Working together, they cleared away enough dirt to reveal the top of a wooden chest, bound with iron and sealed against the desert elements. It was smaller than Timothy had expected, but heavy enough that it took both of them to wrestle it up out of its resting place. 15 years, Donovan murmured, running his hands over the weathered wood. 15 years, this has been waiting. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Their pursuers had finally caught up. "Well, well," called a familiar voice from the ridge above them. "If it isn't the famous Donovan Kane, finally run to ground." Timothy looked up to see Murdoch, the man who had attacked them back at the creek, sitting his horse at the head of a group of at least a dozen armed men. The bounty hunter's right arm was still in a sling from his previous encounter with Donovan, but his eyes burned with the promise of revenge. "Murdoch," Donovan acknowledged, straightening slowly. His hand rested casually on his gun, but Timothy could see the tension in every line of his body. "Persistent, aren't you?" "Persistent enough," Murdoch replied, "and smart enough to bring more men this time. You're outnumbered 12-1, Kane. There's no fancy shooting that's going to get you out of this." "Maybe not," Donovan agreed. "But I'm curious about something, Murdoch. What's your real interest in this? The treasure or the bounty on my head?" Murdoch's smile was cold as winter. "Both, of course. The gold will make us all rich, and turning in a decorated war hero turned deserter will make us famous. It's a profitable combination." Timothy felt anger rising in his chest, not fear, but pure, righteous fury at the injustice of it all. Here was a man who had spent years helping families in need, surrounded by killers who cared nothing for justice or mercy. "He's not a deserter," Timothy called out, his young voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater. "He's a hero, more of a hero than any of you will ever be." Several of the bounty hunters laughed at this defiance from a 12-year-old boy, but Murdoch's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The boy's got spirit," he said. "Too bad he chose the wrong side. Tell you what, Kane, surrender now, and maybe we'll let the kid live. Keep fighting, and I guarantee he dies with you." Donovan looked at Timothy, and the boy saw something in those storm-gray eyes that took his breath away. It was love, not the romantic kind, but the deep, protective love of a man who had found something worth dying for. "Timothy," Donovan said quietly, "whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you, traveling with you, watching you grow into the man you're becoming, it's been the greatest privilege of my life." "Mr. Donovan." "No, son. Let me finish. Your father was right about character being measured by the choices we make when we're alone with our conscience. You've made the right choices even when they were hard, even when they cost you everything." Timothy felt tears stinging his eyes, but he blinked them back. This wasn't the time for grief, it was the time for courage. "So have you," he said firmly. "And we're not finished yet." The treasure chest sat between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Around them, the ancient petroglyphs seemed to watch from the canyon walls, silent witnesses to a drama that would decide the fate of families they would never meet. "Last chance, Kane," Murdoch called out. "Surrender, or we come down shooting." Donovan drew his Colt with the smooth precision of a man who had learned to survive by being faster and more accurate than his enemies. Timothy pulled the Apache arrowhead from around his neck, holding it tightly in his palm like a talisman against the darkness that was about to descend. "Then come ahead," Donovan replied calmly. "But understand this. That chest contains the hopes and dreams of families who have already sacrificed more than you can imagine. You'll have to kill us both before you touch it." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 12 guns against one, greed against justice, with a boy and a treasure chest at the center of it all. In moments, the shooting would start, and Timothy would discover what kind of man he truly was. The first shot shattered the desert silence like thunder splitting the sky. Timothy threw himself behind the treasure chest as bullets began to whine through the air around them, their deadly song echoing off the canyon walls with ear-splitting intensity. Donovan's modified rifle, a weapon he had personally altered for both precision and rapid fire, answered with methodical fury, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. "Stay low, son," Donovan shouted over the gunfire. "And keep that chest between you and them." Timothy pressed himself against the wooden strongbox, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it would burst from his chest. The Apache arrowhead clutched in his palm seemed to burn with inner fire, and he found himself drawing strength from its ancient power. Murdoch's men had spread out along the ridge, using rocks and scattered boulders for cover as they poured gunfire down into the amphitheater. But Donovan had chosen their position well. The massive stone sentinel provided solid protection, and the treasure chest itself was thick enough to stop most bullets. "Kane," Murdoch's voice carried over the battle. "You can't win this. You're just delaying the inevitable." Instead of answering, Donovan shifted position and put a bullet through the hat of one of the bounty hunters, close enough to part the man's hair. The message was clear. He could have killed the man just as easily. But he was showing restraint, even in the midst of deadly combat. Timothy watched in fascination as Donovan fought with a combination of military precision and frontier resourcefulness that spoke of years spent surviving impossible odds. The giant cowboy moved like water, never staying in one position long enough for the enemy to draw a proper bead on him, but always maintaining enough stability to make his own shots count. "Mr. Donovan," Timothy called out during a brief lull in the firing. "There's 3 of them moving around to our left." Donovan's head snapped in that direction, and Timothy saw him calculate angles and distances with the practiced eye of a veteran soldier. The modified rifle spoke again, and one of the flanking bounty hunters spun around and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Good eyes, son," Donovan acknowledged. "Keep watching our flanks." The boy realized that despite his youth and inexperience, he could contribute to their defense. His small size allowed him to peer around the treasure chest without exposing much of himself to enemy fire, and his sharp eyes could spot movement that Donovan might miss while concentrating on the main group of attackers. The battle raged on under the brutal desert sun, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Murdoch's men had numbers, but Donovan had superior position and skill. Every time the bounty hunters tried to advance, the giant's rifle would force them back to cover. But Timothy could see that their situation was gradually deteriorating. Donovan's ammunition, while carefully conserved, was not unlimited, and more concerning was the steady trickle of blood that had begun to seep from a graze along the giant's left arm, evidence that at least one enemy bullet had found its mark. "You're hit," Timothy said during another brief pause in the shooting. "Just a scratch," Donovan replied. But Timothy could see the pain in his eyes. "I've had worse." It was then that Timothy noticed something that made his blood run cold. While the main body of bounty hunters kept them pinned down with covering fire, 2 men had worked their way completely around the amphitheater and were now climbing down the canyon wall behind them. "Mr. Donovan!" Timothy shouted. "Behind us!" Donovan spun around just as the first man reached the canyon floor, his gun already drawn, and aimed. The range was too close for the rifle. This would be settled with handguns at point-blank distance. What happened next unfolded in a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. The bounty hunter's gun roared, flame and smoke erupting from its barrel. But Timothy, acting on pure instinct and the courage that had been growing within him throughout their journey, threw himself between Donovan and the gunman. The bullet meant for the giant cowboy's heart struck Timothy instead, spinning the boy around and sending him crashing to the sandy ground beside the treasure chest. Pain exploded through his shoulder like liquid fire, but even through the agony, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if this moment of sacrifice was exactly what he had been meant for. Donovan's roar of rage and grief shook the canyon walls. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, and the bounty hunter who had shot Timothy died before his own gun smoke had cleared the air. The second flanking attacker met the same fate a split second later. "Timothy!" Donovan dropped to his knees beside the wounded boy, his weathered face twisted with anguish. "Son, why did you—" "Had to," Timothy whispered, surprised by how weak his voice sounded. "Couldn't let them hurt you. Too many families counting on us." The shooting from the ridge had intensified as Murdoch's remaining men realized their flanking attack had failed. But Timothy could see something in Donovan's eyes that hadn't been there before, a terrible, implacable fury that promised death to anyone who stood between him and his mission. "Stay with me, boy," Donovan said fiercely. "You hear me? You stay with me. We're going to finish this, both of us together." Timothy managed a weak smile, his hand still clutching the Apache arrowhead. The ancient stone seemed to pulse with warmth and strength, lending him courage, even as his lifeblood seeped into the desert sand. "Together," he agreed. The sight of Timothy's blood on the ancient sand transformed Donovan Kane from a careful, strategic fighter into something altogether more dangerous. The boy's sacrifice had awakened something primal in the giant cowboy, a protective fury that burned away all considerations of self-preservation. "Murdoch." Donovan's voice boomed across the amphitheater with the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in the hell of battle. "You want this treasure? Come and take it. But understand this, every man who tries will die." The gunfire from the ridge faltered as the remaining bounty hunters heard something in that voice that made their blood run cold. This wasn't the desperate defiance of a cornered man. This was the promise of a predator who had chosen to hunt. Donovan helped Timothy into a more protected position behind the massive stone, then opened the Confederate treasure chest with reverent hands. Inside, exactly as he had expected, lay neat stacks of gold coins and carefully wrapped bundles of currency, enough wealth to transform the lives of dozens of struggling families. But beneath the gold, Timothy glimpsed something that made his heart swell despite his pain. The chest also contained letters, hundreds of them, written in careful script and bearing the seals of grateful families from across the country. "What are those?" Timothy whispered. "Letters," Donovan replied, his voice gentle despite the rage that still burned in his eyes. "From the families I've already helped. They write to thank me, to tell me how their lives have changed, to let me know that their children are getting educated and their farms are thriving." Timothy managed to focus on one letter that lay open on top of the others. It was from a woman named Sarah, thanking Donovan for the money that had allowed her to keep her late husband's farm and raise her 3 children with dignity. She wrote of her oldest son learning to read, of her youngest daughter's laughter returning after years of hardship, of hope blooming again in a life that had seemed destined for despair. "This is why," Timothy said softly, understanding finally and completely. "This is why it's all worth it. This is why," Donovan agreed. Murdoch's voice cut through their moment of connection. "Touching scene, Kane, but it won't change anything. You're still outnumbered, and the boy's bleeding out. Surrender now, and maybe we'll get him to a doctor." "Mr. Donovan," Timothy said urgently, gripping the giant's arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them use me against you. Don't let them win because they're willing to threaten a child." Donovan looked into the boy's eyes and saw there a moral courage that humbled him. Timothy Crawford, 12 years old and bleeding from a gunshot wound, was more concerned about completing their mission than saving his own life. "I have a better idea," Donovan called back to Murdoch. "Why don't you come down here and face me like a man? Just you and me, no tricks, no ambushes. Winner takes the treasure." The proposal was met with silence from the ridge. Timothy could almost hear the bounty hunters conferring among themselves, weighing the odds and considering their options. "What's the matter, Murdoch?" Donovan taunted. "Afraid to face one man when you've got 11 others backing you up?" "I'm not stupid, Kane," Murdoch finally replied. "I know your reputation with that gun. Then you know I'm going to kill every last one of you, unless you start showing some sense," Donovan shot back. The only question is whether you want to die like a coward hiding behind rocks, or like a man who had the courage to stand up for what he believed in. Timothy watched as something shifted in the dynamic above them. He could hear voices arguing, could sense the tension, as Murdoch's authority over his men began to crack under the pressure of Donovan's psychological warfare. Besides, Donovan continued, his voice carrying easily in the desert air, you might want to know what you're really fighting for before you die for it. Gold, Murdoch replied. Enough to make us all rich. Gold that's going to help families rebuild their lives, Donovan corrected. Widows and orphans who lost everything in the war and never got the help they were promised. That's what you're trying to steal. Hope for people who have already sacrificed more than you can imagine. From his position behind the stone, Timothy could see several of the bounty hunters shifting uncomfortably. These weren't all bad men. Some were probably just desperate men who had fallen into bad company and worse choices. Don't listen to him, Murdoch snarled. He's a deserter and a thief. Whatever sob story he's telling you, remember that he stole military secrets and abandoned his post to help people who needed help. Timothy called out, his young voice carrying clearly despite his injury. He gave up everything, his rank, his reputation, his safety, to make sure families could survive. The boy's words had an impact that surprised everyone. There was something about his obvious youth and sincerity that cut through the cynicism and greed that had brought the bounty hunters here. The boy's right, one of them called down. This ain't what I signed up for, Murdoch. Killing a kid to steal money from widows and orphans. Shut up, Collins, Murdoch snapped. But the damage was done. Timothy could see men standing up from their positions, holstering their weapons, and beginning to back away from the confrontation. Within minutes, Murdoch found himself with only 3 supporters, instead of 11. Looks like your army's deserting you, Murdoch, Donovan observed. Maybe you should consider doing the same. The standoff had been transformed from a hopeless battle into something entirely different, a test of moral courage that had found Murdoch and his remaining allies wanting. The final confrontation lasted only minutes. Murdoch, abandoned by most of his men and facing the combined moral authority of Donovan's cause and Timothy's courage, made one last desperate attempt to claim the treasure through violence. But his remaining allies lacked the conviction to face a Medal of Honor recipient fighting for justice, and when the shooting finally stopped, Murdoch lay dead beside the ancient petroglyphs while his last 2 supporters fled into the desert. Timothy's wound, while serious, proved less life-threatening than it had initially appeared. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Donovan's battlefield medical training, learned during years of treating wounded comrades, was enough to stop the bleeding and stabilize the boy for the journey ahead. You saved my life, son, Donovan said as he carefully bandaged Timothy's shoulder. But more than that, you saved those families. Without your courage, your willingness to stand up for what's right, this treasure might have ended up in the wrong hands. Timothy, pale but alert, managed a weak smile. We saved them together, he corrected, just like we promised. The journey home took 2 weeks, traveling slowly to accommodate Timothy's injury and making careful detours to avoid any remaining bounty hunters. But it also gave them time to plan the distribution of the treasure, to discuss which families would benefit most from their dangerous mission, and to reflect on everything that had changed between them. During quiet evenings around their campfire, Timothy began writing in a journal, recording not just the events of their adventure, but the lessons he had learned about courage, justice, and the price of doing what's right. The leather-bound book became his most treasured possession, more valuable to him than any gold. What will you tell people when they ask what happened to you? Donovan wondered one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the desert sky. The truth, Timothy replied simply. That I met a hero who taught me that sometimes breaking unjust laws is the most patriotic thing a man can do. When they finally reached the edge of settled territory, they were met by an unexpected sight. Timothy's father, Samuel, accompanied by several other men from their community, waiting beside the familiar creek bed where their adventure had begun. "Pa!" Timothy called out, his voice carrying joy and exhaustion in equal measure. Samuel Crawford took in the sight of his transformed son, older, scarred, carrying himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before, and understood immediately that the boy who had ridden away was gone forever, replaced by someone entirely new. "Son," Samuel said simply, embracing Timothy carefully to avoid jarring his wounded shoulder. "We were worried when you didn't come home, but I can see you've been exactly where you needed to be." Over the following days, as Timothy recovered his strength and shared his story with his family, word spread throughout the community about the young man's adventure and the treasure that had been recovered for deserving families. Instead of condemnation for associating with an outlaw, Timothy found himself regarded as a hero who had risked everything to help people in need. Donovan, true to his word, disappeared shortly after ensuring Timothy's safe return home. But he left behind more than just memories. He left behind a portion of the treasure, enough to transform the lives of the Crawford family and several of their neighbors who had struggled through difficult years. Months later, letters began arriving from across the country, grateful notes from families whose lives had been changed by the distribution of the Confederate gold. A widow in Ohio whose farm had been saved from foreclosure. A veteran in Kansas who could finally afford treatment for injuries sustained in battle. Children in Missouri who were able to attend school because their mother no longer had to choose between education and food. Each letter was treasured by Timothy, who understood that they represented the real victory of his adventure with Donovan Kane. Years passed. Timothy grew into a respected man in his community, known for his integrity, his compassion, and his willingness to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He married a good woman, raised children of his own, and built a life that would have made his father proud. But he never forgot the lessons learned during those 2 weeks in the desert with a giant cowboy, and a treasure chest full of hope. When Timothy's own children were old enough to understand, he would tell them the story of Donovan Kane, not as a tale of adventure and excitement, but as a lesson about moral courage and the importance of standing up for justice, even when it came at great personal cost. "Your grandfather always said that a man's character is measured by what he does when he's alone with his conscience," Timothy would tell them, his weathered hands holding the same leather-bound journal he had written in during those long desert nights. "Donovan Kane taught me that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on official battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose between what's easy and what's right." The Apache arrowhead, still hanging around Timothy's neck after all these years, would catch the firelight as he spoke, reminding him of Wise Crow's prophecy about transformation and the price of growing up. 25 years after that fateful encounter by the creek, a letter arrived that would be Timothy's last communication from the man who had changed his life. It was brief, written in Donovan's familiar handwriting, and postmarked from a town far to the west. "Timothy," it read, "I wanted you to know that the work continues. Over the years, that treasure has helped more than 200 families rebuild their lives and find hope again. But more than that, your courage and conviction that day in the canyon reminded me why the work mattered in the first place. You may have been just a boy when we met, but you taught this old soldier what it truly means to be a hero. The Medal of Honor they gave me was for one day's bravery, but the real honor has been knowing you and seeing the man you've become. Your friend always, Donovan Kane." Timothy read the letter many times, his eyes growing misty with memories of desert sunrises, campfire conversations, and the moment when a 12-year-old farm boy learned that the greatest adventures weren't found in books, but in the choices we make when others need our help. He kept that letter in his journal, along with all the others, testimonies from grateful families, updates on children who had grown up to become teachers and doctors and honest citizens because someone had cared enough to give their parents a second chance. As Timothy aged into an elder himself, respected throughout his community for his wisdom and integrity. He often reflected on that moment when he had offered to help a stranger with an injured horse. Such a small gesture, barely worth remembering under ordinary circumstances, but it had rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water, touching lives he would never meet and changing the world in ways both large and small. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind blew across the familiar landscape of his childhood, Timothy would touch the Apache arrowhead at his throat and remember Wise Crow's words about transformation. The frightened boy who had hidden behind sagebrush while dangerous men shot at each other was long gone, replaced by a man who understood that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what needed to be done, despite that fear. And sometimes, in those twilight moments between day and night, he could almost see them again, a giant cowboy and his faithful horse, riding toward the horizon in search of families who needed hope, carrying with them the knowledge that even the smallest acts of kindness could echo through generations. The treasure they had recovered was long since distributed, transformed from gold and currency into homes and educations and opportunities for people who had thought such things were beyond their reach. But the real treasure, the lesson that ordinary people could choose to be extraordinary when extraordinary times demanded it, that treasure would endure as long as there were those willing to remember that justice sometimes requires us to stand against the very systems we've been taught to respect. Timothy Crawford lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as a man of unshakable integrity and boundless compassion. When he died peacefully in his sleep on a warm spring night, the Apache arrowhead was still around his neck, a reminder of the boy he had been and the man he had chosen to become. His journal, filled with the story of 2 weeks that changed everything, was passed down through his family like the sacred artifact it had become. And sometimes, when his descendants read those carefully written pages, they could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats on desert sand and the voice of a wise grandfather reminding them that there comes a moment in every life when a single act of kindness changes everything. Forever, the story of Timothy Crawford and Donovan Kane became legend in their part of the world, not because of the treasure they found, but because of the treasure they gave away, and the reminder that heroes aren't born extraordinary, but choose to become extraordinary when the moment demands it.